I have been invited to summarize yesterday. And this is one of these things where you agree to something months in advance, and then the day comes, and you kind of realize that you don't necessarily know how to do that thing. So yesterday was like about 9 hours of talk, very interesting talks. And I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? Maybe I should make a note anytime somebody says something interesting, which meant that I ended up with 30 pages of notes that I haven't had time to read or reduce down to any coherent form. But I'm going to do my best, and the other aspect of it, I guess, is to provide some kind of connective tissue, some kind of overview of what was going on yesterday. So I will do my best. So yesterday began really with Shuddhabrata Sengupta's keynote talk, and I realized everybody was calling him Shuddha, but I don't really know him, so I'm not going to do that. And one thing that he did in this talk was to assemble some conceptions of the planetary. His talk's called Planetary Pursuits. He assembled some conceptions of the planetary from different times in history and different places. And the upshot, what that assembly made clear, is that ideas of the planetary have always been in flux, and they have been contingent on where people are looking from. And this is clearly a very useful model, I think, to set against globalization, because globalization presents itself as a kind of teleological endpoint, and something logical, but it's just one world picture, and it's a very ideological picture. It's very helpful for globalization to suggest that there is, or for the agents of globalization to suggest that it's the only way, that it's the destiny of the planet. But because it's such a problematic structure, it's very, very helpful for us to have other pictures, because then you have the idea that things can potentially change. And it's not helpful, again, to the agents of globalization to have this sense that things are changeable. And I think this is something that really came up in this talk, a kind of different world picture, a possibility of different world pictures. And something that came across in the whole day, I think, was the importance of maybe seems really obvious to say, but the importance of the cultural imaginary, the idea that there are other visions, other versions of what we have here. So Shuddhabrata said that instead of the flattening process of globalization, the picture has to include planetary change and room for difference and relations against universalizing. And so in regard to this, he brought up Edouard Glissant and the archipelago model and mondialité, and made the point that we tell stories about the world from where we are, and really these different versions, these different models have to be in conversation, in relation with each other, rather than one dominating. So he built up a kind of archipelago of models of the planetary. He went through some of the different origins of the idea of the cosmos, the different places that these had originated. We saw images of Indian astrolabes and paintings and statues that picture the planet as something to be controlled. But against this, the model of seeing the planetary he proposed had more to do with small details, I think. How you can see the planetary and planetary change, in particular, in things that have the residue of geological time and kind of the residues of change over geological time. So he showed us images of ginkgo leaves, Geiger counters, and ancient Lebanese trees. And I very much like this idea that the planetary, our conception of the planetary, ought to be indivisible from change and flux. That's something that I feel came over strongly. And he made the point that you can create relations across scales. So you can take something very small and extrapolate to the largest scale from it. So one of his examples was that the number of people on the planet weighs the same as the number of ants, which I'm interested in how that information was found. And that the Baltic Sea needs to have less salt in it than human tears do as a marker of global warming. The picture, again, the picture that was built up was that the planetary condition is fluid. There's fluidity in it. And Shudabrata then transitioned from that, I feel, in the talk to the idea that everybody has the right to take their own fluid place on the planet. So he began then to talk about global protests and showed some very interesting diagrams of how protest has operated in recent years and where it's happening, how much of it there is. And the point was made that these protests now often start in local issues, that they're often driven by young women, and that they often don't have a visible leader. So you get this conception of a difference in the nature of protest that is, he says, rooted in the local, in caring and protection and repair. And I'm not sure whether the question that was asked after his talk about whether this is reinforcing stereotypes of femininity was properly answered. I'm just summarizing here, but I feel that that's maybe still an open aspect. So that was the keynote. Just to return again to this idea of fluidity, I think it's good that it was addressed right at the start, because it seemed to be a theme that ran through various discussions yesterday concerning transcultural exchange. Many of the models that we saw discussed involved a kind of giving up of control, I felt, or an erasing of the binary between control and non-control. Maybe Renzo was talking about this. He was talking about a vertical imposition of something that then goes horizontal. So Marina Foukidis brought up the conception of mythexis in terms of mutual dialogue and a kind of a conception of an improvisatory encounter, an ongoing encounter that we are merely the present iteration of, I suppose. And she made the point, I think, that this kind of interaction might usefully happen outside of the locked-in structures for community that capitalism creates, like social networks. And this is another thing that began to come up, I think, more and more in the course of the day, the digital, non-digital binary that seems important. And that, I suppose, our exchanges, they're already transnational and across borders in many ways because of digital culture, and this is a good thing in some ways, a bad thing in other ways. But to go back to giving up control, this is something that came back, I think, with Alexander Koch's New Patrons program and their idea of a kind of more horizontal patronage system. And I was very interested in what he said about the Cameroonian Pygmy community and how that project evolved into them designing their 21st century incarnation of themselves. And again, Renzo Martins' project in the Congo, which has also been a model of relinquishing control, so that the Congolese community have basically ended up doing what they want with the white cube that he imposed on them. So it's down and then across a lot of this. Okay, and then we also heard from Charles Escher and Clementine Delis in terms of the undoing of museological structures. That was a big part of what they were talking about. And they're both in different ways involved in a decolonizing of the institution. And I have to say, I don't have that much to add to what they said, but I'm still kind of processing it. Sorry on that. Excellent summary there, no? Right? Yeah. Everybody get in the time machine. Alexander Koch made the point that what connected the positions in the roundtable yesterday, these were that they were all trying to do something that meets a lot of resistance. And it's very easy, I think, to fall back on old models and not do the hard thinking that is necessary to kind of countenance new ones. And this thinking ourselves into new models and undoing old ones, again, I think it seems to be a big part of what's going on in this conference, or has been so far. And on a personal level, I can sometimes feel resistance. You know, I'm like, oh, this is not art, or this is not, you know, this is far enough away from art making to, it should be called something else. I think feeling like that in these situations can be quite healthy. In a way, it shows you that something is going on, that, then there becomes a question of like, well, is it not art? Is it art? Am I having that feeling for a good reason, or is it really not art? I don't know, so you have to unravel these things for yourself. So later in the afternoon, the discussion moved more into this conception of going beyond the binary and a range of ways of doing that in artistic practice, in magazine making, curating, and art/activism, I guess. We heard from Bushra Khalili, whose work engages with North Africa and its diaspora and colonial history. And in a way, this brought us back to the start, to the keynote, because Shudabrata's talk raised the question of, it's hard to say whether he fully raised this question, but it was certainly raised in Khalili's talk. This question of how we speak about a radical solidarity, how we find the language for this. This is another theme, I think, that has been running through all the discussion about communication and binaries and crossing binaries here. What solidarity means at this point, what we might call it. And we heard about Will Furtado's Contemporary And magazine, which brings together critical voices from an African perspective. And as an editor at an art magazine, I think this is incredibly valuable because there's been a discussion going on for quite a long time now about how in the kind of mainstream art magazines there's a lack of voices, lack of writers of color, if you like. So that it's happening there is really important. It needs to happen more in mainstream magazines as well. And then there was Paul Feigenfeld's talk where he talked about binaries that have already been surpassed, about the different meanings of occupation. So occupying space, but also having a job, and geographical occupation and cognitive occupation. He gave various examples of this. And the kind of collapsing binary between work and non-work, and collapsing binary between the human and the digital. And a lot of the upshot, I suppose, was that it was a fairly dystopian picture, but then he did talk also about how digital culture enables projects like this controversially named Refugee Phrasebook. I'm kind of wary, I feel, of like reducing everything to, I've probably already hugely done it, but I don't want to reduce everything to a few themes too neatly and close things down. I feel like the second day of this conference is probably going to be a lot about unraveling and continuing some of the positions that were articulated yesterday. But one big takeaway I had, I feel, is just this idea of alternative pictures, I suppose, that I mentioned at the start, and the sense that the picture that we have at this point, the globalization picture, is just temporal, it's ideological, it's not the only picture that we have to have. And we're in a situation now where the greatest problem, of course, is apathy, the assumption that nothing can be done, that if you go out and protest, it doesn't appear on the news, that we're on a perpetual downward slide in terms of our relation, in terms of global warming, in terms of all kinds of things, in terms of cognitive capitalism, da-da-da. So things like this, I think, are really helpful for just letting you immerse yourself in different pictures of the world for a period of time, and then you can potentially go out restored. And then, for some reason, after a couple of coffees this morning, I started to go off on one about the conference model, but I think we don't want to hear that. I'm somebody who likes to work about a 3-hour day, so I realized yesterday that there's sometimes an ill fit between these kinds of things and human capacity, I suppose, to stay conscious, or processing information. And I don't know whether this is something we want to get into, but there's a sort of parallel between the Biennale model and the conference model. There's a sense of like how full can we pack it? How much can we put into these 10 hours or 12 hours or something like that. I'm going to advocate for morning conferences that last for 4 days. I should probably get off the stage now, I think. Yeah, so there we have a partial summary of what happened yesterday. Thank you very much.